And we're back. This is episode 418 of the Colombia Calling podcast. I'm Richard McColl here in Bogota, Colombia, 2,600 meters closer to the stars. My very special guest is Rafael Stuve, who's in Houston at the moment. We're going to talk about not only his podcast, the State of Venezuela podcast, but we're going to talk about, well, let's just talk about Venezuela, Colombia, and what's going on in the world at the moment, because I feel now, obviously, for good reason, for justifiable reason, Ukraine and Russia have taken the airwaves. I mean, we understand why, but we can't ignore what's going on in this area. And you guys that listen to this podcast, obviously tune in because you want to hear about what's going on in this part of the world. So we're going to talk Colombia, Venezuela, Russia, and so on. And Rafael is perfectly positioned to discuss these things as the producer, director, creator of the State of Venezuela podcast, available wherever you get your podcast. So, Rafael, welcome on the Colombia Calling podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me, Richard. I heard the last episode, and I heard that your guest was the guest that had the largest amount of views for the podcast, which means that it's going to be a tough act to follow, but I will do my very best.
Yes, that's right. That's Sergio Guzman from Colombia Risk Analysis. And yes, but it was from last year, and we were talking about the protests, and there was nothing else in the news apart from the Paro Nacional in Colombia. So he's gone over 3,000 listens now, downloads. So it's very, very good. And of course, last week's episode on the Colombian congressional and legislative elections was there to kind of explain a little bit of the chaos that's taken place, but we recorded too early to get the whole issue of the voting fraud in and so on, but so be it. That's the nature of the beast. But anyway, Rafael, you're in Houston. You are, you're part of the Venezuelan diaspora. You have family and friends still in Venezuela. Your family is originally from Maracaibo. And I mean, tell us really what's going on right now, because it's no longer in the headlines. What I'm getting is, we have, obviously you have Maduro, Nicolas Maduro, and you have Juan Guaido. I feel that Diosdado Caballo is the one pulling the strings, but what's going on in Venezuela at the moment? I mean, you're the expert.
Oof. All right. Where do I start? So I think to some degree, your listeners, if they're tuned into what's happening right now in Colombia, there's no way to avoid the tangential effects that are brought out by what's happening in Venezuela. I mean, as you guys know, you guys have at least, and I'm gonna have to apologize in advance because I'm actually battling the flu. I've been sick with the flu for almost a week now, but I'm at the tail end of it, so I'll do my best. But no, getting back to what you asked, because it's a great question, and we can go hours on end about exactly what the state of Venezuela, no pun intended, is. It's really hard because, as I mentioned earlier, north of 2 million Venezuelans of the 6 million that have left the country since 2014 have found themselves in Colombia. And part of the reason is because, again, you have a humanitarian crisis, the likes of which this hemisphere has never seen. I mean, there are murmurs among certain pockets of society that conditions in Venezuela have improved. And there may be some truth to that in the sense that you have bodegas that are popping up in certain parts of Caracas, in certain parts of the country, like, for example, Puerto La Cruz, where there's some semblance of a middle class, but it makes up a small majority, and it pales in comparison to the vast majority of the folks that are still living below the poverty line, below extreme poverty. I mean, you have, for example, last we checked, national survey data indicating, of course, not sanctioned at all by the government because they don't publish any sort of official reporting. It's last I checked, at the very least, 90% of the country lives below the poverty line, and you have of that 75% living in extreme poverty. So that lends itself to an extremely dire situation where you have a lot of folks that unfortunately aren't able to get 3 meals in per day, and they're having to make that dangerous trek, not just to Colombia, but to other parts of Latin America, to the United States, a lot of them having to cross that dangerous Darien Gap right in between Colombia and Panama, which is frankly not an area that's not meant to be traversed because it's very just miles of dense jungle. But it just shows the peril and the desperation that Venezuelans are, they find themselves in, and that they're willing to, the conditions that they're willing to undergo in order to find freedom on the other side. Freedom meaning some semblance of economic security, right? Now, as far as the domestic situation, it's difficult to say because on the one hand, you have a regime that is as dangerous as ever. The Maduro regime has consolidated power very much to the detriment of an opposition that I think has withered in influence, unfortunately, over time. So in 2019, the interim government of Juan Guaido had the staunch support of the international community. We're talking about at least 60 nations worldwide that recognized Juan Guaido as the legitimate interim president of Venezuela, as opposed to Nicolas Maduro, given that he had engaged in all sorts of fraudulent tactics to win the 2018 presidential election. There was a strong movement to try and oust him and really pressure for, number one, the usurpation of power, two, a transitional government, and three, leading to free and fair elections. But unfortunately, that hasn't transpired. And part of the reason is that, again, the Maduro regime has consolidated power so much that they have been able to take out legitimate opposition from the National Assembly, have installed really their own puppet National Assembly in the form of a constituent National Assembly. There are a lot of dynamics in the inner workings of the legislature that are so complicated that, and it's done on purpose, right? They overcomplicate it so that it makes it a deeper hole to get out of. And they did this again in the span of 3 years. That, in tandem with the fact that you have external non-state actors that are working to sustain the continuation of this regime. You have non-state actors like Russia, Cuba, China, Iran, Turkey, all to varying degrees, right? Some more directly involved than others, particularly the case of Russia and of Cuba. Those are particularly concerning. And just as a shameless plug, you can hear in depth episodes that I've done with other experts where we really go into the depths to which these countries, these non-state actors are really involved. And of course, as your listeners are well aware of, probably, you have the ELN as well. And you also have dissidents of the FARC that are fighting for territory along the Colombia-Venezuela border, which makes the situation all that much more difficult. And the ELN is one of the groups that's actually operating very much inside of Venezuela, particularly in the Apure state of Venezuela. So a lot of that makes it the situation where I have another Venezuelan friend of mine that, just in conclusion, just to give you, I guess, this 30,000-foot view, he describes it as a culmination of the movie Mad Max, the movie Jumanji, and the movie 1984, all rolled up into one. And that would succinctly describe the situation today in Venezuela.
Those are quite diverse examples. I guess you've got the anarchy of Mad Max, the chaos and the jungle of Jumanji, and then of course the Orwellian situation with 1984 and Big Brother watching everything. That's quite a description. You touched on so many points there. Of course, as you said, the 30,000-foot view. I just want to say, you said 6 million Venezuelans have left. That's above 10% of the population of Venezuela has gone. I mean, that's, when you think about it, it's difficult to even imagine or consider 10% of a population going. And as you describe, if this continues, that people failing to have 3 meals a day, failing to have an economic freedom, being able to provide for their families and for their well-being, this exodus will continue.
Absolutely. And I think part of the problem also is that there has been no accountability, and there's been no sign from the regime to stop what they're doing or to lessen the oppression that they have exerted on the opposition, on civil societies, on the citizens themselves. I mean, I'll give you two great examples. Number one is the fact that just in 2020, you had a situation where there was a fact-finding mission that was dispatched by the United Nations, the Human Rights Council to be specific, and they actually ended up determining, there was a report that they put out that was over 400 pages long, and it offers key evidence of extrajudicial executions, forced disappearances, thousands of cases of torture that have been committed in Venezuela since at least 2014. And really key to all of that is the fact that all of this was done within the purview of the regime itself. They were not just privy to all of these systemic abuses taking place, but in a lot of times, in a lot of instances, they actually gave orders for these systemic abuses to take place. That in tandem with the fact that now you have the International Criminal Court recently also embarking on this formal investigation to see whether or not crimes against humanity have been committed by the armed forces and by government individuals within the Maduro regime since at least 2017, because you've had thousands of people, unfortunately, that have been imprisoned, that have lost their lives. And we're basing all of this off of key testimony as far as the descriptions of the torture that has transpired over there. You have American prisoners that have been unjustly detained in Venezuela as well. So there's been no sign of any of that being alleviated, being corrected, amended, none of that. And this is in spite of good faith, and really, I think, to the detriment of the opposition, looking for opportunities to continue negotiating with this regime. There have been 10 different instances, at the very least, since at least the presidency of Hugo Chavez, to negotiate in good faith with this regime. And those talks continue to break down because of the fact that the regime themselves pull out. So this leads, unfortunately, to this removal of hope from the equation, let's say. So Venezuelans, unfortunately, and this is really what I fear the most, Richard, is Venezuelans accepting this as the status quo, saying, well, Maduro's not going anywhere, so we might as well just live with it. That, I think, would be the worst case scenario.
I can see that. That's a very interesting point, certainly on the status quo, something we will step into later. I wanted to pick up for a second on the ELN and the FARC in Venezuela. I mean, we've known this, the FARC dissidents, the Marquetalia, whatever they call themselves now. We've known this for a while, and that border is very much fluid, back and forth. Last year I was up in Cucuta and observing the trochas and talking to people and the refugee crisis and so on. The ELN, you say, is that the Ejército Liberación Nacional, the National Liberation Army, started in around 1964, 1965, officially the last remaining guerrilla group, on paper in Colombia, officially, but we can argue this one until the cows come home. But at the same time, as you said, a huge presence in Apure, so they're on the border. The other side of the border is Arauca in Colombia, and of course coca growing regions, and the flow of weapons, the flow of people, the flow of coca paste for the production of cocaine. I've read reports about the ELN, and I've seen reports of their influence extending all the way across into illegal mining across Venezuela. I've never been able to, obviously, completely sort of back up, or you read reports from one place, but I'm never fully convinced. But I mean, how far does the ELN's influence go into into Venezuela? I mean, by the maps, almost as far as the border with Guyana.
It's been significant, Richard. I think there's absolutely there's a lot of truth in the reports that have been coming out since at least 2018, analyses that confirm very much the presence of the ELN, specifically finding themselves in these mining operations, specifically in the Orinoco mining arc. So for your viewers and for your listeners, the Orinoco mining arc is this really, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that it's like this El Dorado of the Western Hemisphere that's just rich in all sorts of natural resources. We're talking about bauxite, coltan. Coltan is it's the ingredient that is used, or not the ingredient, but it's the key component that's used to manufacture microchips that you can find in your phone. So your iPhone, there's a good chance that it has coltan inside of it. And I don't want to speculate the extent to which that coltan comes from Venezuela, but there's a large presence of ELN inside of this sort of El Dorado, which we call the Orinoco mining arc, which is in the state of Bolivar in Venezuela. And we're talking about an area that's about as large as the state of Ohio here in the United States. And that has been sort of the proverbial piggy bank of the Maduro regime, because remember, the Maduro regime is currently sanctioned by the United States and by other Western entities, more targeted, albeit, but they're prohibited from being able to export their oil to other parts of the world, specifically the United States, which was their primary source of export. So they've looked for other ways since then, and instead of, I guess, ramping up other sectors of the economy, they've looked for other illicit ways to sustain their staying power. And one of them, apart from the drug trafficking, is the activity in the Orinoco mining arc, where, as you mentioned earlier, the ELN is very much present. They're continually skirmishing with indigenous communities that are really at risk from the ELN establishing such a presence there. They've also found themselves nestled in the western parts of Venezuela, where they actually help with the distribution of the clap boxes. So the clap boxes, of course, are the government rationed boxes. Well, now they're bags, because I don't know to what degree they're able to manufacture the cardboard for the boxes themselves, but that is it's a state program, or a government program that is used by the regime as a form of social control. And there's just so much that I can go into that really explains how the government has been so successful in extending their staying power. But yes, to answer your question, the ELN that presence that they have, and the alliance that they have with the regime, because the regime has effectively invited them, not just them, but also the Segunda Marquetía, as you mentioned earlier. Marquetalia, sorry, long morning. Right. The Segunda Marquetalia, which has its leaders that were also invited effectively by the Maduro regime back in 2019. So they've created this sort of safe haven where they're able to operate largely uninterrupted inside of Venezuela.
It's peculiar to think that a guerrilla group, ELN, for example, so designed, trying to topple the Colombian state, is now so very much, I mean, back in the day in the Cold War and so on, it's so very much embedded in Colombia. And the ELN themselves, they have a kind of nomadic kind existence. They don't create camps, and so they sort of move around a lot. But it seems to me that they're very established then, especially, as you say, in this Orinoquia area, and then around the mining, legal, illegal, and so on. I mean, it's a complete evolution, not only in Venezuelan society, but in the way that Colombia will have to, or has to, address the issue of illegal armed groups, which kind of brings us to this issue of the Apure bordering Arauca. I mean, in April of this year, 2022, there are all sorts of skirmishes taking place. I don't doubt that they continue. They're just not hitting the news anymore. Could you explain to the listeners a little bit what was going on there in that particular border section?
Yes, absolutely. So right there, what separates Arauca and Apure is the Arauca River.
Mm-hmm.
So on the one side, you have Arauca in Colombia, and then you have Apure in Venezuela. And that has been a hotbed for violence for the longest time, specifically because you have warring factions of dissenters of the FARC, which, as your listeners know, made peace with the Colombian government back in 2016. But there are dissidents of that organization that have since looked to continue their illicit activity inside of Venezuela, particularly. And you have different factions that are looking to actually continue this, right? So, as I mentioned earlier, you have the Segunda Marquetalia. The Segunda Marquetalia is a group that is in line, in alignment with the Maduro regime. So that one is led by Ivan Marquez and Jesus Santrich, if I'm not mistaken. And they wanted to try and get another faction, which is the 10th Front, to align with them inside of Venezuela, because all of them didn't accept the peace agreement with the FARC in 2016, but they all maintain, again, that active border presence between Colombia and Venezuela. And since then, because when the 10th Front didn't accept that, the government, the regime of Venezuela, basically authorized a campaign to try and take out the 10th Front inside of Venezuela. So what the regime made it seem like was this heroic, patriotic, nationalistic campaign to take out drug trafficking and purge it from the fatherland of Venezuela. Because I'm speaking in brash terms, because those are the brash terms that the Maduro regime likes to use when it speaks in basically every occasion, right?
I can imagine. Totally.
But the reality of the situation, Richard, is that they're basically looking to clear that area for the Segunda Marquetalia to be able to operate largely uninterrupted. And a lot of this came to a not a standstill, but there was sort of there was a climactic event back in February, so last month, where the Colombian military actually ended up killing the leader of the 10th Front, which I believe his name was it was Arturo. I can't remember what his full name was, but he was the leader of the 10th Front. And in doing so, that has led to I guess another stage of this a lot of this conflict going on between the Segunda Marquetalia, which is, by the way, allied with the ELN, but the 10th Front is in a battle with the ELN and Venezuelan security forces. So it's this hodgepodge of all these different warring factions. And unfortunately, the people who suffer the most are the ones that live along the Colombia-Venezuela border. So I believe the town of Arauquita has been under curfew for the past month or so because of the violence that it's found itself in that part of the region as well. So it's a very delicate situation, because there are no signs of stopping when you have so many different factions that are looking to resolve a conflict that have so many different players involved.
It's almost impossible. This power struggle that takes place there. And of course, as you say, it's the local people, the people on the ground who suffer. I had no idea that it was the Segunda Marquetalia trying to move it in there to control, with the tacit blessing of the Maduro regime, to get out the Frente 10, the 10th Front, which, again, it's a dissident regime, but there's nothing political there in the Cold War sense. It's a narco trafficking group of 10th Front. They run that area into, but I mean, it's just, I don't see that clearing up anytime soon. And this issue and this theme that you brought up of this, let's say, the sort of, we're going to drive out the 10th Front from within Venezuela, therefore we will rid the Colombian plague from Venezuela. I can hear Maduro saying it in, a sort of floripond way. It appeals very much to a nationalistic, dialogue. And that brings me to the next point, is that very recently there was an article in Foreign Policy magazine about, what Russia's invasion of Ukraine might mean for Venezuela and Guyana. And of course, Venezuela, for those who don't know, and if you've seen a Venezuelan map, it's quite special. Venezuela claims, I would say, around a third of the Guyanese territory. When you look at it on a map, there's a big red shaded part in a Venezuelan map, and it's like a territory in dispute. And of course, this saber rattling and nationalism, I mean, we can but speculate. But let's talk about that a little bit. You've addressed this on your podcast, the State of Venezuela Podcast. What is the reality? What is the likelihood of a Venezuelan sort of trying to roll their tanks across this area, into Guyana?
So I think a lot of that has to do, I personally believe, with the likelihood of success of this quote unquote special military operation in Ukraine that is being carried out right now by Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin by extension. And I say that because as I'm sure your listeners might know, Venezuela and Russia are very, very closely aligned. They've signed hundreds of agreements, not just on the economic front, but also on military. So Venezuela is always going to go up to bat for Russia. Now, the reason why, for example, if there's any sort of pushback or anybody points out that Venezuela abstained from the United Nations General Assembly vote to investigate Russia or just to condemn them on a grander scale, it was not that they didn't want to participate. It's that they weren't able to. They weren't able to because Venezuela owes around $40 million in unpaid dues to the UN. And because of that, it actually lost its voting rights a while ago. Otherwise, I'm very confident that Venezuela would have proudly voted against the condemnation of Russia's actions in Ukraine. And part of the reason we know this specifically, and this is discarding the decades of support that Vladimir Putin has shown to both Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro, is the fact that Venezuela, or I should say Nicolas Maduro, publicly announced its support for Russia prior to them moving in. And not only that, but even after Russian attacks against Ukrainian civilians started, Venezuela was one of 5 countries in the UN Human Rights Council to actually vote against an urgent session to begin with. And that followed a visit by the Deputy Prime Minister of Russia to Caracas, where, again, another Russia-Venezuela security cooperation agreement was signed. Nicolas Maduro called Vladimir Putin to pledge basically to reiterate his pledge to strengthen cooperation. And this made headlines for a brief moment, but Russia's deputy foreign minister himself ruled out the possibility of enhancing Russia's existing military presence in Venezuela. So when you have these different elements at play, Venezuela is watching very, very closely what's happening in Ukraine, because in a sense, they could use it to justify invading either Colombia or Guyana. Because before we get specifically into Guyana, let's not forget, I don't know if you saw this, Richard, but there was actually just a couple of days ago, a statement or commentary from Venezuela's number 2, let's call him. He's the vice president of Venezuela's Socialist Party. And he suggested that there should be a military operation carried out in Colombia similar to that of Russia's in Ukraine. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically said, well, I'm not an expert on what's happening in Ukraine, but the more time passes, the worse it will be for the Nazis of Ukraine, because he's borrowing, of course, the language that Putin has used to call for this quote unquote denazification of Ukraine. It's ridiculous, but I digress. He says, because the denazification will be rooted out. And then he said, and this is what I just really made me roll my eyes. He said, why don't they take the opportunity to decocainize Colombia to see what's left after that? So when you have this sort of brash commentary coming from somebody like Diosdado Cabello, who, as you mentioned earlier, is really in a lot of ways the brains behind the continuation and really the construction of the Bolivarian Revolution, someone who has justified the aggression of Putin in Ukraine. I wouldn't put it past him or Nicolas Maduro to launch further attacks along the Colombia-Venezuela border in the name of patriotism and expunging drug trafficking, that which they themselves have been sanctioning or providing a safe haven for years. So it seems very, very hypocritical to me. But in the case of Guyana, Guyana just recently filed with the International Court of Justice to try and settle this border dispute between Guyana and Venezuela. And although Venezuelans do, for the most part, believe strongly that the state of Guyana, or as we call it, the Essequibo region, belongs to Venezuela, I think that Venezuelans will stop short of aligning themselves with a position taken by Nicolas Maduro to use that as a means to justify an incursion of a neighbor's sovereignty, the same way that they've done with Russia and Ukraine. And tying it back to the Russia-Ukraine situation, if that fails, I don't see Nicolas Maduro using the failure of Russia to justify his own military campaign to go inside of Guyana, just because the world will have fresh in their minds how not only that it's wrong, but the consequences that await a country that tries to pull off something similar, regardless of where it transpires around the world.
Also, I mean, there's an international community sitting on the sidelines at the moment to try and topple Maduro in any way, shape, or form, and a sanctioned invasion of a sovereign state would enable foreign intervention. I mean, that's even naysayers would say, well, he did do this, especially, as you say, with this Russia-Ukraine situation right now. It would, but I think of the geography, it'd be very hard to sort of roll tanks across into the Essequibo area and so on. But what's let's say Venezuela's naval capacity, because they could blockade, I suppose.
They could. And I think a lot of that, unfortunately, I have to say, is credited to Russia. Russia has been a huge provider of a lot of the different weaponry and the naval fleet, and also the tanks. A lot of different components of the military that Venezuela is able to brandish is very much thanks to both Russia and China. But the fact of the matter is that Russia has been the one that has been more willing to really sink its money into Venezuelan quicksand and continue to arm Venezuela, understanding how much of a loss that is an investment, to the point even where I believe Colombia's foreign minister actually met with the ambassador of Colombia inside of Venezuela because of concerns that they wanted to raise, specifically given the fact that the biggest concern is that these armed groups that we've been talking about earlier could get their hands on these weapon systems that Russia has delivered to the Maduro regime in order to fight specifically this supposed incursion of the 10th Front. But really, it's just been an excuse to continue to militarize that border and keep Venezuela armed to the teeth. Now, Russia has responded by saying that we're not going to we're going to make sure that those weapons don't fall in the hands of these irregular armed groups that are operating inside of Venezuela. But there's no guarantee that could happen, right? And there was actually in 2017 a report from Reuters saying that Maduro probably, or his regime, has some 5,000 Russian-made surface-to-air missiles. So it speaks to the military capacity that Maduro has been able to wield very much in large part thanks to Russia.
Mm. And am I wrong in mentioning that Venezuela got the rights to be able to produce Kalashnikovs, AK-47s, some time ago, Russian weaponry?
I'm actually not sure about that.
Yeah.
I would have to look into it, but it would not surprise me.
Yeah, I mean, I remember something, but it's just popped up in my head right now. So it's and this connection to Russia. I mean, as you say, they are very much interlinked. This has to then feed towards this Russian practice of major disinformation coming out, not only Russia, Venezuela, and so on. How do you see this at the moment? This disinformation campaign?
That's probably one of the most concerning features. So much so that it's partly what inspired me to start producing this podcast in the first place. You have a lot of these different outlets like Sputnik, Russia Today. Russia Today, just to give your audience, Richard, an idea of how influential it is, not just in Venezuela, but really in Latin America at large. If you look at the statistics of viewership of RT inside of Latin America, I know this is the case in Venezuela, but they have, at least on Facebook, Russia Today in Spanish has more than double the amount of followers than Russia Today in English. And it gives you just an idea of how successful Russia has been in disseminating a lot of the disinformation that they like to plug into different media outlets inside of Latin America. Another great example of that is Telesur. Telesur, I don't know to what degree they operate inside of Colombia, but they operate very much in places like Cuba, Bolivia, I think to some degree, and still in places like Ecuador, Uruguay. Although because of the fact that ideologically, there's a lot of oscillation from one side of the aisle to the other in Latin America, that really determines the extent to which outlets like Telesur or like Russia Today can be successful. But in the case of Russia Today, they've maintained a very, very successful presence inside of Venezuela. And I think really to bring it closer to home and to your viewers, they've been very successful in trying to weaponize disinformation inside of Colombia. And the way that they do this is not necessarily making light of any sort of, let me rephrase that. It's not necessarily that they antagonize or they make Russia to be the good guy. What they do is they like to sow discord among their own citizens and really bring people into the more extreme ends of the spectrum. And so what they've done really successfully is, in the case of the skirmishes between Colombia and Venezuela, is paint Duque and his administration, they being the drug traffickers, they being the dictatorship or the illegitimate government, and Venezuela being the democracy just looking to defend itself. It's like this sort of role reversal that seems on its face just ludicrous, but the reality is that because of the way that they're able to present this information with semi-presentable, quasi-intelligent journalists that sprinkle different elements of truth, but just completely stretch it to the point where they're able to point the finger at somebody else, they're able to make it really seem like that's the case. And a lot of people buy into it. So to answer your question, yes, it's extremely concerning because on a global stage, at least in the English-speaking world, Russia Today is able to paint this picture of what's transpiring in Venezuela as this CIA orchestrated coup that they just plucked Juan Guaido out of nowhere and they just fitted him with a suit and tie and said, "Hey, you're going to be our guy for regime change." And he said, "Sir, yes, sir, CIA." That's the way that they like to paint it. But the way that they present this information, they will really convince people of it. So it scares me that they have this sort of capacity, not just in Venezuela, but in places like Colombia or Brazil or other places that are headed to presidential elections very, very soon.
It's Yeah, this is interesting, definitely, and it pulls in the emotions, of course, and bringing back to thoughts of like the bad old days in the 80s and 70s, and of course interventionist policies into these countries, and the people are still alive today who recall this. So it's very easy to appeal to this. I have to ask, and it just again it popped up. What is your take, because of course the Russia-Ukraine kind of issues, conflict, war, this invasion, the I guess the how would you put it, the feelers put out by the Biden administration to Venezuela, I guess, regarding oil supplies?
Great question. So for those of you who don't know, I'll briefly explain this to the audience. It's funny. The day right after I put out my interview with Dr. Evan Ellis about Russia's relationship with Venezuela, not one day later, I come to find that there is a sudden trip of the highest level delegation of senior officials from the United States to Caracas, the highest in 5 years at least. And it was an envoy from the National Security Council and the special envoy for hostage affairs and somebody else on that team. And they met with the regime of Nicolas Maduro and by extension with Maduro himself. And from what I understand, this was something that was months in the making. So it wasn't something that was planned. It wasn't an impromptu visit. Let's put it that way. At least that's what they say, according to the reports that were put out by the White House, the way that they explained it. And while I'm happy that they did end up securing the release of one of the members of the Citgo Six, which for your audience is a group of 6 Venezuelan Americans that have been detained unjustly in Venezuela since 2017, along with a Cuban American that's been inside of Venezuela since 2019. I believe he was there literally for tourism purposes. He was a tourist, and they nabbed him and tried to impose these trumped up charges against him, saying that he was involved in some sort of suspected coup plot or something like that. I'm not sure, but they were able to get him released, which is important. So to answer your question, I have a lot of thoughts on this. Number one, I'm disappointed for 2 reasons, both from a personal and a practical standpoint. I understand that there needs to be some change in the strategy of maximum pressure, because clearly that has not worked. As I mentioned earlier in the podcast, Maduro's power continues to consolidate at the expense of any sort of opposition movement or really any sort of resistance whatsoever. There are very few pockets of legitimate opposition that have a voice inside of Venezuela anymore, unfortunately. So from a practical standpoint, Venezuela's oil sector is in complete tatters. Its production capacity stands at about 700,000 barrels per day. So Colombia actually, by comparison, is producing more oil than Venezuela. And it would take a massive cash infusion of at least 12 billion per year for nearly a decade to restore production to optimal levels. While they do say, I think they have backtracked since then, from the day that Press Secretary Jen Psaki here in the United States said that one of the things that was discussed was energy security. We had folks from both sides of the aisle, both Republicans and Democrats, expressing their concerns, because really what that means is it's a backtrack from a promise that President Biden campaigned on, which is to stand with the Venezuelan people and to be tough on Maduro, in contrast to what he described as former President Trump appeasing Maduro. So when you have this sort of potential pivot from obtaining oil from one tyrant to obtaining oil from another, it's hard to justify. It is. And for an administration that prides itself on caring about the environment, this is also particularly devastating, because PDVSA has presided over what we could describe as ecocide for at least the better part of 5 years. So it's a destruction of of the natural beauty of the Amazon region because of the illegal oil mining that's been taking place. There have been an average of 5 oil spills per day inside of Venezuela, and between 2010 and 2016, there were about 46,000 different oil spills. So, excuse me. So there's still a lot of speculation as far as where this could go, because one of the accomplishments that the Biden administration touted in this visit was a commitment for Venezuela or for the Maduro regime to return to the negotiating table. But that was something that was shot down by Diosdado Cabello himself. And he said that's actually not going to happen anytime soon. And even if it did, as I mentioned before, Richard, there have been 10 different opportunities to negotiate, the last of which was shot down specifically because the United States extradited Colombian national turned Venezuelan diplomat Alex Saab. Alex Saab is a Colombian national who is basically the primary financier, money launderer of Nicolas Maduro himself. And he was extradited from Cape Verde to the United States. And what I think is just, it's laughable to me, is part of the reason that the Maduro regime suspended their end of participating in the talks is they actually wanted to include Alex Saab as a participant of these negotiations. I don't understand in what universe it would make any logical sense to bring somebody like that to have a say in negotiations between the Venezuelan opposition and the Maduro regime. But regardless, that was their reasoning for wanting to exit, to pull out. So to think that they're going to plug themselves back in and we're not going to have the same result, I think speaks to a little bit of maybe naivete, wishful thinking, or really just giving too much of a benefit of the doubt to a regime, a cohort of kleptocratic, autocratic individuals that show no signs of wanting to surrender power anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, why would they really? Unfortunately, say it. Why would they want to? They've got absolute power, and we know of the corruption around it. I didn't find I don't well I would have my questions surrounding whether this meeting between Biden and well Biden's team and the Venezuelan regime was months in the making. I would have my my doubts around that, because it seems so knee-jerk just after let's say the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It seems so fast, and surely if it was months in the making, you'd be like, this is not the moment. This is not the moment to do this. It doesn't right. come across so well when you think of diplomacy, international relations, and so on. Moving on to our final point, and we have to do it. And I know my listeners they'll be going, but why hasn't he talked about the Colombian elections? Let's talk about the Colombian elections. Our current frontrunner, Gustavo Petro, former M19 guerrilla, former mayor of Bogota, left wing, and then, of course, now his vice presidential ticket with Francia Marquez. The opposition to him, so the right-wing Federico Fico Gutierrez, they're all talking about, and it's a very emotive subject as well. Petro wins, and he's going to turn Colombia into Venezuela. Now, again, today, well, let's say we're recording this, the Washington Post article comes out, and Sergio Guzman, director of Colombia Risk Analysis, was quoted, in fact, and he said, listen, in Colombia, people are so fed up with the status quo, and that's why I referred to it earlier, that Venezuela isn't the most frightening thing anymore, turning into Venezuela. Really the most frightening thing for Colombia right now, due to the underlying problems, inequality, and so on, corruption, poverty, the conflict, the lack of any activity really on the 2016 peace accords, the deaths of social leaders, and so on. But the fear in Colombia amongst, I would say, the majority in terms of people who would vote for Gustavo Petro, it's a certain continuity of this status quo. As a Venezuela expert, how do you see this? That the possibility of a left-wing president who has had, I guess we can say, some sort of relationship with the Chavez and Maduro regime?
The awful truth, Richard, I'm terrified. There's no other way around it. And I think that my fellow Venezuelans will agree with me. It's hard to put into words really the prospect of having neighboring Colombia, which has been a saving grace for the Venezuelan people. I think Venezuelans are in an enormous amount of debt to Colombia for showing such such empathy for the most part. I mean, of course, it's on a case-by-case basis. Certainly that's not the case with the mayor of Bogota, who unfortunately has made some incendiary remarks against the Venezuelan people that are living inside of Colombia. But I know that's not an opinion that is shared with most Colombians. Most Colombians, I think, have done a great job of really assimilating the Venezuelan people into their new home, and understanding that this is really through no fault of their own. When you bring in first of all, a former M19 guerrilla who not only has a past of having more of a conciliatory tone towards some of these non-state actors, but also being a close friend of Hugo Chavez, he went, excuse me, my apologies. He went to his funeral. He went to his funeral back in 2013. And I was reading somewhere in the Washington, not Washington, excuse me, the Wall Street Journal, that Gustavo Petro said that he went to a supermarket in Caracas where he said, you see, the shelves are just super well stocked. Everything is fine here in Venezuela. I don't know what people are freaking out about. He's really waffled on his stance on Venezuela, and I think understandably so. He can't keep that sort of tone when it's universally understood that Venezuela is very much under the thumb of an ironclad dictatorship. There's no getting around it. When you have international bodies like the UN Human Rights Council, the International Criminal Court now looking into crimes against humanity committed by this regime, it's hard to maintain a conciliatory tone. I mean, you have other leftists, let's say, leaders that have been more on the fence because of it. For example, you have Gabriel Boric of Chile, who I think has done a decent job of trying to distance himself from the Maduro regime. I can't say the same in the case of Pedro Castillo, but excuse me, I can see Colombia going the way of Pedro Castillo in the sense that a lot of this economic turmoil and a lot of the fears that Colombians have, which are justified, right? Because of the outbreak of COVID-19, because of the protests that took place last year, a lot of the state-sponsored violence that was reported to have taken place because of security forces authorized by President Ivan Duque. I understand all those things, but I would say this as a word of caution to the Colombian people. Be very careful what you wish for. This is a man, Gustavo Petro, who wants to expropriate private pension savings and wants to stop Colombia's oil production, which right now is Colombia's #1 export. And from what I understand, he was asked if he would respect his 4-year term as president, and he wouldn't give a straightforward answer. So this all rings far too familiar for Venezuelans who were in a situation like that in 1998. He touched the nerve of disenchanted, or I should say Venezuelans that were disenchanted with the two-state party system. And when you believe in somebody who comes in and wants to swoop in and present themselves as a savior, if it seems too good to be true, it's because it is. Venezuela is the perfect example of that. I mean, Cubans warned us, you need to be careful with this Hugo Chavez guy. We can see you guys turning into Cuba. And the vast majority of Venezuelans sort of just balked at that idea of becoming a reality. And now, not only are we worse off than Cuba, but we find ourselves in the same situation as Haiti. I mean, we're comparable to Haiti now. if Colombians don't think that that could happen in Colombia, I give you the case of Hugo Chavez. Again, a man who was with whom Gustavo Petro was very, very close. And this is by no means an endorsement of Fico Gutierrez or Sergio Fajardo, but I would encourage folks to look at more serious alternatives and to please not let emotions get the best of you, because the last time that was tried in Venezuela, we ended up in the situation that we're in now.
There's a couple of things. I am not a Petrista. I look at this. Oh, I can't vote, but I look at this election with, my shoulders just fall when I just look at it. I'm like, God. A couple of things. I don't know. I think that having Venezuela alongside Colombia obviously is, a great warning that Colombians would heed. Obviously, it appeals to emotions. I don't know enough about the pension story to be able to comment on it. I've seen some refutations but I don't know enough about it. But regarding the oil exploration, I think there was something taken out of context. This is not to defend him, it's just to put it into context. I think he said no new oil production or exploration, but the current ones would continue. Who knows? But as you say, Gabriel Boric in Chile has done a fine job of distancing himself. Pedro Castillo in Peru, not so much. Gustavo Petro, who knows, because he's been very, very wishy-washy on this. The big difference I see, and I'll just put this out there, is that Chavez, of course, had the support of the military or much of the military, whereas Petro will go into, if he wins, he'll go into a presidency with no support from the military or the police or so on. And he alienated them all as mayor of Bogota, so he'd go in without that. So that there is that. There is that as maybe a same. I think if he were to win, not a lot would go on. He might try and do some of these things, but like when he was mayor of Bogota, his hands were tied from the very beginning, anything he wanted to do. And so I think he would be like a very negative president. He'd be always up there on the balcony screaming, that nobody's letting him, and the establishment and the machinery is not permitting him to do anything and to affect change and say that the people should go out in the streets. But I think at the same time, he'd be like a López Obrador figure, just bitter there, and he would do things that hopefully could be, I don't know, undone, or maybe some that were beneficial. I don't know, but I worry about this. I worry about this election a lot. This one, Federico Gutierrez, Gustavo Petro, Sergio Fajardo. We're still waiting for him to wake up. So we will see. May 29th, the first round. But again, words of warning, of course. It's important to hear all sides of this debate, and to have you, Rafael, talking about the Venezuelan context and the Venezuelan way that things can be seen and the connections between the two countries. And this Colombia has shown remarkable humanity in maintaining the borders open to accept Venezuelans. This should be applauded and celebrated. It's true. I don't think that there was any other choice. I think the two countries are so very linked. Obviously, not just the geographical, the families. They extend across the borders, especially in the real boom years of Venezuela in the 70s and 80s, and the violence in Colombia. So many Colombians went across, and then that sort of osmosis with families, Colombo Venezuelans. It's one and the same. And yes, the mayor of Bogota, Claudia Lopez, said some very inflammatory things right at the beginning, I think, of COVID and so on. But now, if you've seen that the terminology has changed, you don't blame everything on the Venezuelan diaspora anymore. You say foreigners, you say extranjeros, right. And suddenly I'm like, hang on, I'm an extranjero. But it's like, hang on a second. So we see a whole bunch of like Brits, knife wielding Brits, and so. But let me just take this moment and say thank you so much for your time. Thank you for all of this information, which you clearly have coming out of your ears and being able to express it so coherently and clearly to me and to my listeners. And let me recommend you all out there, listen, tune into, subscribe to the State of Venezuela podcast. So very interesting. It's available wherever you get your podcast. Rafael Eduardo Stuve, thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
Richard, thank you so much.
Well, we've overrun a little bit, but it has been a fantastic conversation. I've certainly learned a great deal. Certainly, have to consider everything now. And we've covered Russia, we've covered Ukraine, we've covered Guyana, we've covered Colombia. There've been touches on Peru and Chile and so on. I mean, wow, we've really got there. So let me take this time again. The State of Venezuela podcast is on Twitter as well. Rafael Eduardo Stuve. It's on everywhere you get your podcasts. Tune in. We'll be back next week with more Colombia-related content here on the Colombia Calling podcast. Thank you to all of you who've signed up to our Patreon campaign, patreon.com/Colombia Calling. It allows us, your donations allow us to be somewhat financially viable to continue going. This has been episode 418. I've been Richard McColl. Thank you for listening.